Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 414 of the FCPA Compliance Report. Today I have with me Jim Garcia. Jim is an internal auditor who has worked at various jobs literally across the world doing internal audit, root cause analysis, and gap analysis. Today we will talk about his favorite audit assignment. But first, as many of you know, I've expanded the Compliance Podcast Network, and I'm always on the outlook for new podcasts. If you've ever wanted to start a podcast but really didn't know how to do so, listen to a word from our sponsor, One Stone Creative.
If you are enjoying this show, you might enjoy hosting your own. As an expert in your field, you have skills, knowledge, and insight that can help you expand your practice, meet new people, and create amazing content to share with the world. In as little as 2 hours a week, you can dramatically change how you promote, fill, and position your business. And One Stone Creative can show you how. Learn more at onestonecreative.net.
Jim's had a 30-plus year career in internal audit. He's audited companies literally around the globe and specifically in the FCPA realm. But today we're going to talk about one of Jim's favorite audits. He recently completed a multi-year project with the San Diego Zoo. It's a fascinating exploration of the role of internal audit, what is risk in an organization, and how do you deal with multiple stakeholders in a nonprofit. The FCPA Compliance Report is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back for another episode, and you are in for a real treat today. Today, I have with me Jim Garcia. Jim and I met at a recent Association of Certified Fraud Examiners Houston chapter meeting, and it turned out that we had a fair amount in common, at least with our backgrounds in the FCPA. And so I had the chance to visit with Jim, and he had one of the most, I should say he's an internal auditor, and he had one of the most interesting assignments I've heard for audit, and I asked him if he could come on the podcast and talk about it, and it was his work in the internal audit realm for the San Diego Zoo. So Jim, with that somewhat long-winded introduction, first of all, welcome and thank you for taking the time to visit with me today.
Hey, my pleasure. Good afternoon.
So, Jim, you've had a long and distinguished career in audit. You've worked for corporations. You've been really at the forefront, I think, of teaching and education and helping younger internal auditors through professional work with the ACFE. But I was wondering if you might just detail for our audience your professional background, your FCPA work, and really what brought you to the point where the San Diego Zoo would call you.
Well, it does take me back. I mean, I started way back in the day with Texaco as an accountant and moved on to different internal audit assignments. Then started doing a lot of contractor audits, and myself and others wrote the contractor audit and the fraud manual for Texaco. And then I was asked to go over and work with some of the international auditors, and I ended up in West Africa. And that was kind of like at the forefront, 97 or so, when the FCPA violations were starting to, the investigations were starting to gain traction and the attention of the DOJ. So Texaco was very anxious to make sure that we took the right remediation action and disclosures. And so finally, I was just asked just to stay over there for the last 4 years of my career. Once Chevron took over, I decided to take early retirement and then moved on to doing different SOX. I've been back to Nigeria 8 times on different assignments and fraud investigations and litigation support. And because I really have no problem. I enjoyed the work over there and I enjoyed the people. Just have to understand the culture and work within certain limitations. I had a very enjoyable 5 years with Target Resources as their chief audit executive. When I had a chance to move on, I took it, and I was doing some work with one of the majors so I could do more international travel. When I traveled to 5 or 6 different countries doing FCPA support as well as vendor reviews. I was at home just sitting around, and I got a call from one of the colleagues I worked with back in 95 in Nigeria, and he was telling me about a fraud that he had experienced. He was the third-party outsourced internal auditor for the San Diego Zoo in San Diego, and he wanted to know if I'd be interested in coming over and performing a risk review, fraud risk review, because what had happened was there was a supervisor at one of the retail outlets at the zoo that had been substituting void slips for cash, and she was able to use and cajole her subordinates into letting her use their pass cards in order to make these transactions as well as the ones she did herself. It came to light when someone complained about that use through the employee hotline, and the investigation ensued, and it was written up in the newspapers there. And the lady was convicted and served a little bit of time. So since the San Diego Zoo has three main components that comprise San Diego Zoo Global, they have the main zoo in San Diego proper, then out in Escondido about 20 or 30 miles north, they have the San Diego Zoo Safari Park, huge campus with the collections. And then also adjacent is the Institute Conservation Research, where they are in 35 different countries, where they assist to complete the mission of the San Diego Zoo Global Society and Foundation, which is to prevent the extinction of animals. One of the things that was interesting about the initial fraud is there wasn't really an automated system for catching these voids or a process. The marketing group really came forward and looked into it. But like I said, there was two other entities, and the other one, of course, is the Safari Park, and they needed some encouragement and assistance in applying the same kind of IT controls and processes. So they enthusiastically went after it. It's like two divisions not talking to each other. So we spent a lot of time facilitating that. And then as I was asked to build a fraud matrix, I used that opportunity to compare how the different entities were approaching similar subjects. Because, there's, $100 million in transactions each year or over that. And that's point of sale, that's membership, that's receipt of donations, receipt of charitable contributions. There's a lot of money that goes through that organization. They've got assets of between $700 and $800 million currently. They had about 5 million people go through both the Safari Park and the zoo last year, so they were setting new records. I think a lot of that has to do with they've spent over $80 million, I know, at the zoo for the Africa Rocks exhibits, which takes visitors through 7 different temperate zones, all the way from the high deserts all the way down to Antarctica. Very, very well done. And then out at the Safari Park, they got the a Walkabout, which is an Australian theme park.
Jim, it sounds like in this process, in addition to audit work, you did a lot of education and really getting people to talk across silos. Would that be a fair assessment?
It was, and it was quite enjoyable. I know you've done a lot of work in the energy business, and the people can sometimes be quite cynical and very protective. The attitude for those folks over there was they want to just complete their mission, and that they're Southern Californians, and they're pretty laid back, and they rose to the occasion to move out of those silos.
So how did you actually test for internal control weaknesses when you have that variety of compensation, of charitable donations, and types of or different avenues for money to flow into the organization?
Well, I really wasn't there to so much supplement the existing internal audit plan, because the gentleman had all those areas basically covered, and would hire folks to test the internal controls. I started looking at it from what can go wrong and do we have the right governance and controls in place as they existed. For example, I started just applying basic COSO SOX entity level controls, like do purchase orders and contracts have audit clauses? That's something that had been overlooked, and the general counsel got on that right away, and we started putting in standard T&Cs on the POs and contracts for the right to audit the vendors, which later turned out to be very useful as we continue the discussion.
In addition to, I think you mentioned a little bit earlier that you found at least one, I don't want to say obvious fraud, but one that you pretty easily detected, or at least the zoo had a suspicion of. How did you test for control weaknesses around that initial fraud you uncovered?
Well, it's just kind of a root cause analysis to see why it wasn't detected and what good standard controls could have prevented it or detected it. I went on to test their cash handling controls by doing surprise counts. There's a lot of cash that goes through. It's not just all credit cards. And then I also worked with one of their in-house guys that really focuses on the credit card fraud type aspect and fraudulent ticket sales. A very interesting gentleman.
Jim, you and I both sort of grew up in the energy space, and you mentioned that perhaps we are more cynical here in Houston. But people who work at a zoo may have multiple reasons for doing so, multiple motivations. They may enjoy working with animals. They may enjoy working with the public. They may feel that they're engaging in a greater good. How do people who I would say are at least different than the typical energy company employee, how did they react to someone coming in and really performing a root cause analysis and if not suggesting remediation of internal controls, at least pointing out some internal control weaknesses?
Yeah, great question. The folks at the zoo were very receptive. I'm kind of a hands-on guy, and I like to get to know the folks and how their processes and procedures work. And since I've got that, as you say, quite a lot of long in the tooth experience, it was quite easy to see when something didn't quite make sense. So it really wasn't that difficult. The idea was just talking to the right folks and understanding their accounting system and their purchasing system.
I was a little intrigued when you told me that one of the suggested control remediations involved the human resources director agreeing to strengthen controls as well. Could you at least relate how an HR director might be impacted or might impact what is traditionally seen as a financial control?
As I got going building the fraud matrix, the CFO requested that I go visit with him because she had wanted to know a little bit more about how gift cards, so she could see how much money was going through gift cards, and she wanted to know what kind of controls were in place. The former now he's a former HR guy. He's no longer works there, but he was kind of like hands-on trying to do everything himself. So we talked about segregation of duties and the proper controls. And actually, he was quite relieved to not have to do that. And I said, well, look, I'll help you set up, recommend some procedures for you. And I think you've got some people here that are competent. And that was one of the easier things I did in the 2 years that I was there. Anyway, the CFO liked the way that worked out. So she asked me to start looking at more deep dives and continuing on with just looking at the different expenditures for vendors. I could see that there was quite a lot of money going through benefit plans, and that needed some additional oversight by the financial group. At least their expertise in getting down into the nitty-gritty, the details, the reconciliations, and so the CFO refocused human resources to work on that because previously HR had given it a good shot, but really didn't have the visibility into the union programs. And of course, without shedding too much light on the organization, but they're a well-known organization that was handling these third-party benefits. So that kind of led to more. Jim, just keep going doing dive audits. In fact, she kind of played a play on words like these were guerrilla-style audits, and it wasn't the gorilla that you think of as the large enclosed animal. It was more like go to war and let's see what else you can find.
So I've been privileged to go to the San Diego Zoo a few times. I've actually been a member in prior years. And one of the things I observe, Jim, when I go to the zoo is they're constantly upgrading. They're constantly rebuilding. They're constantly in new construction. It seems to be ongoing, and it doesn't take away from my experience as a zoo member, but it did lead me to wonder, how did you look into it led me to want to ask you, was that an area that you needed to take a look at? And if you did take a look at it, what were some of the things that you tested from the internal controls perspective?
Yeah, it's amazing the amount of construction. One of the most enjoyable things was going behind the scenes and being escorted to where all these major capital projects were doing. And since I've done quite a bit of that in the world business, I was just looking at the procure to pay, the bidding, especially the bidding to see how that was being done. A lot of these projects are kind of like for specialists, but there are some that like building bridges around an exhibit. A good contractor, general contractor knows how to do that. Replacing HVAC, pretty standard stuff. And so you just looked at were the bids being solicited in the proper way? Were they being recorded? Was there favoritism to one contractor over another? Were there potential conflicts of interest between the employees responsible and the contractors? All of those were areas that turned out to be high risk that required some remediation. Again, management jumped right on it because it's very important that the reputation of the zoo, because of the amount of money that folks are willing to contribute and to sponsor, that they feel that the zoo management are good stewards of that trust.
One of the things that I find surprising in my FCPA anti-corruption compliance world is that companies, businesses, or entities who think they have no FCPA anti-corruption exposure, turns out that they may have some. And I noted, I guess it seems to me with the educational component of the zoo, they have literally an international field conservation program, and that it may not be their largest effort. Their largest effort may be, people like me, either zoo members or people who want to go through the turnstiles every day. But even an entity like the San Diego Zoo might have an exposure they had not considered. Did you find that as well?
There were some discussions around that, but the legal department had hired some folks to come in and review that. The relationship that the society has with the mostly government entities, all of those relationships are passed through the legal department and a third-party legal firm. So they're aware of that. And we had a very productive discussion concerning it, and it's certainly in their risk universe.
Well, Jim, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time, but this sounds like it really was just a fascinating project on an intellectual level, on a professional level, and a very satisfying, emotionally satisfying project for you working with the people and the institution itself.
It certainly was, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about it.
So, Jim, I was wondering if anyone wanted to find out more about your work at the zoo, your services, if they could contact you, and if so, how could they do it?
Well, they can go through LinkedIn, of course. That's a good way for messaging, or they can send me an email at jimgarcia57@aol.com. I still use the old-fashioned AOL. It works.
Well, and I would just say Jim's got some great stories, and we just touched on just one of them today. So if you want to hear some really interesting stories from the internal audit perspective, and you're a compliance practitioner, Jim is really the guy to talk to. So, Jim, I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Myself included. Take care.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. If you have any questions, you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. You can email Jim Garcia at jgarcia57@aol.com. I hope you'll join me again next week for another episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. The FCPA Compliance Report is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.